So I'm going to record this class too, because we're still one person shy. Unless Perla had a sex change operation between Monday and today.
We can call him Perla. I'm sure he won't care.
Yeah. All right. Good enough. Good enough. Gluten has been all the rage for a little while. When I was a kid, nobody ever heard of that stuff. Nobody heard about celiac disease or gluten sensitivity, or for that matter, a whole lot of things that we seem to have now. We didn't even have much in the way of peanut allergies. So we carried peanut butter to school and peanuts, all that stuff that you get for now.
What? My mom made me lunch. I was in like first grade. She
Yeah.
made me a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I went to school. I got suspended.
Yeah. Yeah. The school administration didn't have any of my kids. Because that information should be conveyed to parents so that it doesn't happen and defense the kids to what the parents know.
Yeah, especially a first grade.
Yeah,
Now, if I was like in high school and I know you got peanut butter in school,
that'd be a different story.
Well, see,
How's,
that's the thing. The high schools don't care. It's on the kid with the allergy.
other high
handle
schools
it.
are carrying now. They're starting to. It doesn't take much.
Yeah, because
But-
in high school, the only thing they did was they switched from
Yeah.
peanut oil to
Yeah.
vegetable oil.
But gluten, it's a little bit, I think, related to the controversy about genetically modified organisms. Because wheat has been genetically modified. Now we've been genetically modifying wheat for 6,000 years. We just called it hybridization. And it was a natural process. But not necessarily. The methods that they use for putting in various things in wheat to growth, to enhance its resistance to pesticides and herbicides and stuff, unfortunately have the side effect in many cases of actually increasing the number of genes for generating gluten. Well, gluten is what makes bread smooth, does a lot of things. And there is no doubt, I mean, I've had this argument with people who say I'm wrong, but I think there is no doubt about gluten in wheat and other gluten-containing grains. We've done something with soy. You cannot in this country buy soy that isn't genetically modified. It's not sold. You can find heritage wheat that's very carefully grown in isolated areas. You can find there's some farms. We buy some of it because my wife was going through a time when that was one of the possibilities of gluten. So we started buying wheat from Bluebird Grain Farm in Washington. More expensive, maybe 75% more expensive per pound. They fresh grind it, you order it, they grind it and send it to you. So it comes in, it's very finely ground. The dough that you make with it has a very different feel. Many years ago, we used to go to, when we lived in North Carolina, we used to go to a restaurant, one of the finest French restaurants you can imagine, out in the middle of nowhere, in the town of Selma, North Carolina, which is a burg of about 1,000 people. We started going there, and we got to know the owners. We went to him one time. I said, "So why did you come here?" He says, "Within an hour's drive, there are 1 million people." And what he did was he had a fixed menu. For 2 weeks, he would make the same thing. He went there, you got served what was made. And so that kept his prices down and kept the place full, because he was one of the best cooks I've ever experienced. We never had a bad meal, and we went there a lot. But one day we walked in, and he was in a cold. Oh, he was mad. We said, "Well, what's wrong?" He says, "General Mills changed the way they milled their flour, and they told me." And the bread to him felt different. And to us, it tasted just as good. But now I know what he's talking about because the flour that we get from Washington, the way it kneads, the way it rolls out, the texture of the product is very different. It's very different, much smoother. It was a real surprise the first time I made anything with it. I told my wife, man, this feels different. I hope it tastes good. It was, but it was very, very different. So, but it's a heritage flour, so it's a Pharaonic flour, meaning from ancient Egypt actually, and Rome. Egypt was Rome's breadbasket during the Roman Empire. So they used to grow one heck of a lot of wheat. We've been eating wheat and other grains for more than 6,000 years. And all these people that say, oh, we're not meant to eat grains and blah, blah, blah. And I just say, we've got, how many generations, 6,000 years worth of generations that have been eating this stuff? I don't think so.
Well, I mean, new generation.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
that
well,
seems to be an argument with every.
there are evangelical evangelicals for everything. Dietary evangelicals, in my opinion. We we have a naturopath that we go to. She's been tremendous for us, and one of the reasons we started going is recommended by a friend. Well, a whole lot of people were going, and one of our other friends who was going finally fell out with it because this friend is a vegan, and the naturopath says you don't need to be a vegan, and that was it. She wanted nothing to do with it because she is an evangelical vegan. You have to be a vegan or you're doing it wrong. And I've had vegan dishes that are delicious. We lived for 2 weeks actually with a vegan family in Malaysia, and they were Indian vegans, and I mean they could eat that food. Honest to God, we eat like pigs. But when we got out of there, we started eating meat because we hadn't had it. I mean, we certainly had everything we needed. And I tell you what, we think of vegans as these skinny little runts. Not this family.
Well,
No.
if it's done right,
Yeah.
that's the problem. Is that
They eat a lot and they're good size. So, they get plenty of nutrition. And that's part of it. But most of the times, people, oh, you have to eat quinoa. You have to do quinoa. You can take it on the street as far as I'm concerned. Actually, you shouldn't. You should return it. Quinoa has been hijacked by us, and it's starving the Bolivians because that's what they live on. Now it's all shipped out of the country, and it's starving because we want quinoa. One of the reasons I won't eat stuff. Yeah, is this the stupid dietary stuff? You said you really dislike dietary stuff. When I was teaching down in Denver, part of my 208 class was a nutrition class. And that's the way I started. Dietary fads of antiquity. Most of them are useless. We go through the Atkins diet, blah, blah, blah. Well, what happened on the Atkins diet? Not the Atkins diet, of a bloody heart attack. I really helped him. Mm-hmm. And then there's you can't have you have to cut all cholesterol and fats out of your diet. Well, that's pretty dangerous because we need them. These people, what you really need is a balanced diet. My only problem with a balanced diet is that every couple of years the government changes what a balanced diet is supposed to be. So really it needs to be a mixture of protein. You want to get your protein from the rice and beans diet, that's fine. But you need protein, you need sugars, you need fats, and you need trace elements and vitamins and minerals. That's what you need. And you don't have to have a perfectly balanced meal every time you eat. It's okay, even though I never advocated, it's okay to go to McDonald's. It's not going to kill you. Pardon?
It's okay to eat chips.
Sure it is. but in moderation, all things in moderation,
Like,
including moderation, but that's another subject.
my stupid stepfather, he's all kinds of pissed off because he stopped eating bread and he keeps gaining weight. He's convinced that the only reason he's gaining weight is because he eats a lot of bread. But he eats so much of everything else that it doesn't matter what he's eating. He's taking in like 4,000 calories a day.
Yeah, when even if
And he's not.
Yeah. Well, that's part of it. That's part of it. I mean, with diets in general, you know, most of us, if we're constipated, you need about 1,000, 1,200 calories a day. If with moderate activity, meaning if you're on your feet a lot, if you work, you're moving around, another 800,000 calories a day, what you need to maintain your weight. If you are a competitive swimmer, like an Olympic level swimmer, you need more like 14,000 calories a day because you're burning that much energy. Most of us are not competitive Olympic swimmers. But the issue is again, it just blows me away to see people driving up to McDonald's or Wendy's and they get the the Baconator and pea-size the fries and then they have the diet drink.
I know that's so funny.
You know, the problem is sugar does have another purpose that we don't think about in our diet, and that is to tell us to stop eating. It's an appetite control mechanism. It tells you you don't need to eat. It's why we shouldn't ever give children cookies before dinner. We've had this fight with my wife's cousin a number of times. You know, you don't when they come home from school don't give them ice cream and cake. Wait until after dinner because they do that and then they complain about the fact that the kids won't eat dinner. It was, how many times do we have to tell you? You know?
And it's the attitude. She eats when she wants to eat. And that,
And they never starve. That's right.
and see what you were saying about changing what a balanced diet is. We were on WIC and they were telling me my daughter was overweight because they only go based off of BMI.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, really? Because the doctor says that she's perfectly fine. Her doctor says that she's right where she needs to be.
And that should be the only.
Right.
Yeah.
And the lady's like, well, we have to put you on the low fat diet, the low fat WIC, because she's too heavy. And I'm sitting there going, are we looking at the same child? I mean,
No,
don't get
they're
me
not.
wrong. I mean, don't get me wrong, she's bubblegumming. She's bubblegumming right now, so she's bigger because that's the part of the growth spurt that she's in. But as soon as she starts shooting up, it's all going to go away again.
Yeah.
That's funny.
People eat more because they're not getting any signal. Now, in our house, we don't do it. Our children are and so they don't do that pretty much. My older daughter, these flavored, water, soda water, no sugar, basically. But which I think is a waste of time. That's fine. We should make our own money. Yeah, but listen, but the issue with diet sodas and diet these artificial sweeteners is they actually stimulate appetite. So people gain weight and they get really unhappy. They're gaining weight, doing all this. They cut all the sugar out of the diet, which is really, if you look at that they eat, they're loaded with sugar and fat and salt and all sorts of other crap. So diet is and the gluten-free diet. I put on a poster on the discussion This friend of ours that was diabetic, with celiac, and he reacted to meat in the same way that he reacted to gluten. So he was not able to eat, so he was a vegetarian because if he ate meat, he got sicker than he. And so, basically, if they were around, it was hard to feed him because of his diet. They moved to Korea, and you can't be a vegetarian in Korea. It's a virtual impossibility. So he ended up trying to eat some meat and found out he could eat it. In Korea, they grass feed all the food animals. That's it, all grass feed. So he comes back to the United States thinking, well, I can eat meat now. Not more. So
He was having a celiac
he
reaction.
was having a celiac reaction. And I had thought until that time seeing gluten-free on a package of hamburger was just marketing crap. Just trying to cash in on the marketability. Now I'm sitting there thinking, maybe I was a little wrong in that.
Well, and see, my mom always bought the grass-fed meats just because they tended to be local.
Yeah.
And some of the propaganda, they're better for you, which it's debatable, however, whichever way you look at it.
Yeah, local isn't
No.
Certainly not grass-fed.
No, but that was her tendency was if it's grass-fed,
Yeah.
it's probably local enough or,
Yeah, we're
family farm sort of nonsense.
we'll probably buy a quarter of so we're going to try that. It's a little bit more expensive, but you pay a price that's higher than you pay for the cheap cut and lower than you pay for the really expensive cut. So probably all that.
My dad would, when I was younger, once I got older, we didn't have the money for it, but when I was younger, he would buy half a cow, half a pig. And that's
Yeah.
what we ate all the time.
Yeah, we're thinking about a pig as well, but their lamb is way too expensive.
The bacon from
Yeah.
from buying half a pig is
Well, if you can,
oh,
yeah. Well, yeah, that's right.
not that bacon is a cut you might get, but I don't know. But
Bacon's
the
fine.
bacon is so much better.
Yeah, well, I kind of fell out with the bacon people when they started putting bacon on donuts. A chocolate bacon donut. A chocolate bacon donut. That's just ruins the bacon, ruins the donut.
See, I'm a jelly filled
Well, I don't eat donuts. My wife refers to them as little greasy balls of fat. So we don't eat donuts in our house. I think I probably have about one a year. So at any rate, we're going to talk about pain today. Yep, pain. Pain is something that you will get to deal with. Pain is something that's affecting my generation, which, by the way, is a goodly portion of the people you're going to deal with when you get out into medicine. So it's a good idea to have a bit of an understanding of it. Pain is a perception. It's been redefined from sensation to perception because everybody feels it differently. There are the people that can practically have their foot chopped off and say, "Oh, that hurts," and the people that stub a toe and act like they've just had the piano dropped on their head. I mean, they're just like the end of the world. So it all depends on perception. Some people are more pain tolerant than others, and it doesn't really matter. And some types of pain, some people are more tolerant to, than others. Women, for instance, are more have to be more tolerant to childbirth pain. For the life of me, I don't know why the body doesn't have a better mechanism for masking that pain, because it could do it. But maybe that's just part of the process. But nonetheless, there are those kinds of things. But there are also persistent. That's still a relatively short term event. There are types of pain that really. I hope I don't see him land on his head. Must think he's on a high wire. Somebody walking around the big cistern thing out there on the edge. So
Well, he's near the right place.
This is true. Yeah,
Probably the best.
yeah, you're probably right. The
like the
best place
hospital.
short of a hospital. Yeah, that's right. But I might say, if you want to do that, why don't you go over by Poudre Valley, and let them know that you're doing it, so they'll be ready for you. But anyway, pain is something that he could feel a great deal of in a few minutes if he were careful. Anyway, but it's always subjective. We have, we talk about signs and symptoms. Pain is a symptom because we have no way of measuring it. We can ask people to evaluate their perception of their pain, but we don't have a painometer. Oh, you have a 6 pain. We don't have that. We don't have any way of measuring it, because it's really how the brain is interpreting signals it's receiving from the body. And so it's experienced differently by everyone. Pain itself has multiple functions. It's part of our immune system. It warns us that we've just had something happen to us that we need to clean. We've been cut. We need to wash it so we don't get infected. That is part of our first line of defense, is that pain mechanism. Pain is useful as a guide in some cases to where there may be a problem. Usually pain arises from some actual or perceived physical damage. And I say perceived because sometimes it's our anticipation of something. Pain can have several different levels. It can be a result of really damage, somatic pain, or it can be psychological. We all talk about the pain of grieving. That's real to the people who are going through it. And pain is a real issue. But it also is a response that the CNS does, because of course, your finger doesn't hurt. Your brain tells you your finger has been damaged and puts that signal there for you to recognize that you've cut your finger, or maybe smashed it in the door, or whatever. But that's because the brain is interpreting a signal coming from a part of the nervous system into the body. Emily. Yeah, it is. I mean, as I said, pain is perception. If you perceive pain, you have pain. Period. And don't let anybody tell you, oh, that isn't real, because they're not inside your head. They haven't a clue. Thank you. I'm glad you did that.
So, I'm trying to think of how to
All right.
So like in my family, we all have a fairly high pain tolerance. I mean, we're not gods by any means. There are still things that it's like, okay, yeah, I might cry a little bit of this. It hurts.
Yeah.
But that's like my whole family. But my friend, her family is very much the same, but she's not. Like, for example, we both have a wrist tattoo. She cried the entire time getting hers. Whereas for me, it was like, It doesn't necessarily feel good, but it's not cry worthy. Like she was under the impression that she was dying, kind of like she said that the pain hurt so bad she felt like it was her arm was getting cut off.
Mhm.
So how does that work? Because like we
Yeah.
have the same kind of family background where both of our families.
As again, it's it's very, very difficult to say that the ability to perceive pain one way or the other is really genetic.
Right.
It is so individualized. In some cases, we have learned how to deal with pain. And we learn how to deal with pain by having to, one way or another. People who have never been injured don't have a clue what it feels like. It's just like the first time I can remember the first time I remember getting an injection. I suppose I might have had some when I was a baby, but in the mid 40s, they weren't given a whole lot of childhood vaccinations. The first one I remember was polio. That was in 1952 when they were doing the mass immunizations, and they didn't have the air guns. They were using syringes. And so they lined us up at school and marched us in there. And so we got to watch the people in front of us get poked. And by the time it got to us, we were ready to hurt. We were ready to hurt. And they didn't do anything to ameliorate the pain early, which you can do. I've taught injections a couple of times here, and I've taught it a lot down in Denver. And I teach people how to give an injection, which done properly, you won't feel the poke. Or if you do feel the poke, it'll be like somebody took a toothpick and just touched your skin.
Yeah.
So you can do that. They didn't bother. They were vaccinating 200,000 of us. No, they just wanted us to be vaccinated against polio, which was affecting an awful lot of people at that time. Fortunately, I was vaccinated and never had never had polio itself. But the issue was, I remember that well. I remember thinking, oh man, that's going to be terrible. And it was. I decided, just like we were talking the other day, I decided it was going to be bad. And it was. It was as bad as I thought. Now I teach them how to give shots, and I let my students poke me. And it doesn't bother me. Even when they do it wrong, it's okay, it's a little more uncomfortable, period. And I can say, you really should have gone in a lot faster. It would have made it a lot easier on me. Now it's different. The same thing with blood draws. I used to, you want to draw blood? Yeah. And then I guess I was in high school. And we had to have blood tests, and that sort of stuff, and a part of the college application process at that time. I don't know if they still do it or not, but we had to do that. Had to have a physical. And I happened to have a guy. It was a corpsman. We were living on an Air Force base, and this corpsman, I mean, he was the dream phlebotomist. I didn't even feel that needle go in. I was watching it. He was that good. Yeah. That's when I realized it didn't have to hurt. And I was never bothered again. Ever. Went into basic training, and we got 4 vaccinations every Saturday morning, 2 in each arm. And short-term discomfort. They were using the air gun. And the fun thing is, the air gun, the first time in each arm, no sensation. High-pitched squeal in the ear on that side, bone conduction, I'm sure. The second one, however, actually hurt. Even though it was, probably about 1.5 inches below the first one. The second one actually hurt because the pain receptors were activated and ready. It was an interesting thing to experience. But again, for 6 weeks, we got 4 vaccinations a week. That was no fun. Anyway, but pain itself, the sensation is so variable. People that you would think would be tough. One of the instructors down in Denver who taught both phlebotomy and hematology, wasn't bothered by by having a student poke him for phlebotomy, although she wouldn't let a lot of people do it. We had big classes there, and she really couldn't let every student poke her. But she would do it occasionally. But in the hematology class, her fingers were so sensitive that somebody would use the spring-loaded lancet, not the old pointed things they used to drive into you like driving a stake to a vampire's heart. She would have the spring-loaded thing go off in her finger and she'd scream every time. Every time.
That was to check blood sugar?
Yeah, just for
Oh my
for
God.
blood sugars, or we did several of the
I
Cleo
would
Lay type
like
tests.
to see how she reacts to like insulin pumps, like the inserters. They make a lot of sound.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
You're on your side of the arm.
yeah. Wherever is available, because you rotate it. You have to rotate it all the time. So
I'm pretty
Yeah.
close out.
I bet you are.
I'm pretty close out.
Yeah, yeah. So pain itself is really as a result of a sensory stimulus. Of course, as I say, pain is actually interpreted. It's a signal that's interpreted in the brain, same as visual and auditory signals, taste, everything else depends on how the brain is interpreting what is being signaled. So pain is actually a result of a stimulus to the nervous system that can come from a lot of different sources, some chemical, some physical. Chemical sources include classes of compounds called prostaglandins, bradykinins, histamine release can be a signal for pain. Something called substance P from damaged tissues. All of these send a message to our sensory receptors, which we call nociceptors. And then it's carried by then the sensory fibers to the brain, and the brain says, oh yeah, you've been hurt. Or, oh, that was just a little pressure. Or, yeah, somebody did punch you in the nose. Whatever. The brain recognizes it. But it all works through pretty much through the autonomic nervous system. So the signals go to the brain, and the signals are very functional. We're going to talk a little about prostaglandins because they're important in understanding how nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs work. Prostaglandins are really potent hormone-like molecules that are generated actually throughout the body. We thought originally they were thought to generate from the prostate, which is why they're called prostaglandins. But now we know that they're all over, and part of prostaglandin synthesis is a process of forming these molecules from long-chain fatty acids, and they are part of the inflammatory mediators that are also play a key part in inflammatory and pain response. In fact, most of our NSAIDs, it turns out, work by inhibiting these molecules. I mentioned something called substance P. It is released by what are called C fibers, which are part of the nervous system, and generally associated with persistent and chronic and intense pain. One of the ways that opioids work, and it turns out serotonin and norepi, is to inhibit the release of this substance. We have acute and chronic pain. Acute Same as anything else that's acute. It's sudden in onset, and it's an early warning, really, that something's wrong. Something is going on here. You know, it's an alert system. And usually whatever it is that you do to alleviate the warning or alleviate the problem that's generated the warning, be it wash a cut or, you know, put a Band-Aid on, pressure on something to seal up an open blood vessel, usually the pain just subsides and doesn't return. Then you have chronic pain. The acute pain is relatively easy to treat with analgesics. Chronic pain is much more difficult, and chronic is just that. It is persistent, recurring pain, and different causes of pain can result in that. So there are a number of pains. Not all pain is the same. Depends partly on where it comes from. We also don't necessarily, you know, the body is good at fooling itself. There's something called referred pain. And that is when something happens and what you feel is a pain elsewhere. Physical therapists see this a lot with their patients. They will actually be working with a part of the body that's been injured, and the patient will say, that's hurting me in the small of my back or in the middle of my back, even though that's not involved in the actual injury. That's called referred pain, and it's not uncommon. And then there's this oddball thing called phantom pain, which is what amputees feel, pain in the lost limb. They will, if they've lost an arm, they will actually feel pain in the fingers and in the hand.
He lost his leg. And he's never got phantom pain, but he has phantom itching.
Yeah.
So he'll like, well, my foot is itchy, but it's on my prosthetic.
Yeah.
And the only way he can actually like get it to go away is like a brain is itching.
Yeah.
We don't know.
Again, it's there again, it's the brain interpreting a signal it's picking up that's coming through the nerves that used to transmit that signal to the brain. So the brain, even though intellectually the brain knows that foot, that lower leg is gone, you know, yep, the pain system doesn't know that. All it's doing is interpreting these signals, okay? There is pain that is all, you know, very much, very different places within the body and from a number of different sources. And we classify pain by its source. We have vascular pain, which is thought to originate in vascular and perivascular, meaning the tissues surrounding the vascular tissues, thought to originate there, but we're still not quite sure how. Mechanisms of pain and its generation, we can tease out some of the biochemical pathways, but we don't really know what causes it, which is another reason that it's so much a subjective issue. Neuropathic pain is something that comes from injury to the nerve fibers that that connect into the CNS or the CNS itself. Neuropathic pain can be things like sciatica, things like acute back pain from back injuries, and that sort of thing. Superficial pain is you know, your skin, your mucous membranes. Then we have I talked about nociceptive pain. Pain is actually, I want to talk about the transmission of pain for a moment and talk about the current most prominent and best researched theory, which is we call the gate theory of pain. And what the gate theory of pain tells us that if we look through, if we look through the types of nerve fibers we have large nerve fibers, we have small nerve fibers. And they have the information that comes from those is and pain that's felt there is a function of the balance between that information from those two kinds of fibers. Large nerve fibers carry information, non-nociceptive information. In other words, not pain receptor information. Pressure. If you put pressure on a part of your body, just like I'm doing with my upper arm right now, that pressure signal is going to my brain as a pressure signal, not as pain, but as a sensation of pressure. And what it's doing is at the same time, if I stuck a needle in there, I wouldn't feel it, because what happens is if I put more pressure on the large nerve fibers, and the sensation and the signal coming through from the nociceptive receptors, the pain receptors, if the signal is stronger from the pressure receptors, it overrides the pain signal. That's why when you get a cut, you put pressure on it, you're doing two things. First off, you're trying to close off blood vessels, right, to stop the bleeding. But the other is you're overriding that pain response. You probably have noticed that you get a cut, you put pressure on it, it stops hurting. You let go of the pressure, and the pain will come back in a short while. And that's because you've you've overridden the pain signal with a pressure signal. In other words, you've closed the gate for the pain. Obviously, if there's more activity in those small nerve fibers than in the large, then you're going to feel pain. So why is that? Well, large fibers, large neural fibers are associated. You all right? In the hinge? Mm-hmm. Speaking of pain, yeah. Put pressure on it. The large fibers have a thick layer of myelin around them. We talked about the problem in MS and other motor neuron diseases where the myelin sheath that's protecting these nerves is lost. And so the nerves get stimulated, and this causes all sorts of issues, muscle contractions, and so forth. Well, the large nerves are largely motor, in other words, part of the somatic system. And then as they get a little bit smaller and the myelin layer gets a little bit thinner, there's a series of sensory nerves that feel things like touch and vibration and what we call position perception. Okay, the idea of knowing where your body is in space comes from that. As we get smaller, the myelin sheath gets much thinner, and we start getting into the sensory nerves that are actually finding pain and various other receptors, cold and warm and so forth. And then you get down to the truly autonomic nerves that are much thinner and have either no myelin or almost no myelin, very thinly myelinated. And that's what controls the autonomic system. As a result, the myelin layer is somewhat predictive of the kinds of sensations that will be transmitted. Now, nerves don't, nerves do tend to get a little, as they go down through the body, they'll come out a little bit thinner, but usually branches off of the thicker nerves are the thinner ones, and the smaller ones. And so the nervous system is picking up these signals and picking up where they're coming from. And the type of signal itself is important. So if we can't, so part of the issue with pain transmission, remember, pain transmission is sending a signal to the brain that something's going on. If somehow there are no impulses being transmitted to the brain centers, then there's no pain. And one of the ways of making sure of that is to close the gate. And we can do that either by stimulating a stronger signal from a non-pain nerve, or plugging the gate basically with chemicals. Okay? Or preventing chemicals from opening the gate. Okay, so there's a lot of methods that we can use. What happens is the gates themselves have a direct connection to the brain, and the brain has somewhat of a level of control over gate operation, and this actually allows the brain to figure out where the pain is. Can evaluate it? How bad is it? How bad does it feel to this brain? This is where your friend who feels pain more strongly than the rest of her family, it's her brain that's doing that. Okay, it's her brain interpreting that. Because if you did exactly the same injury to each family member and sent as much as possible the same signal to the brain, their brains are interpreting it. Okay, so it just depends on how that interpretation is done. And it can identify it and pick the locale. Emily. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Yeah. What you do is since the brain can actually have there's all sorts of stories about yogis in India who can not feel pain, Yeah, but they shut these things off, and a lot of that's just is educating your brain to put up with it. Okay, people live with pain all the time, and you've got a couple of choices. You can either deal with the problem. Yeah. With endometriosis, good luck. Yeah. You can either deal with the problem, pain that's caused by some pathology, such as a tumor, for instance. You can deal with that. You take the tumor out. That's one method. Then it sometimes works. But the other thing is that people will be able to develop a tolerance to it. And as I say, since it's all perception anyway, it's like me as a kid thinking, oh, that shot's going to hurt, and by God, it did. And now, okay, it's another shot. So what? It'll hurt for a few seconds and go away. And so, if that, so it's an understanding of that, and allows the brain itself can exert some control over the gate itself, whether or not it's going to get a signal. And so there is a tolerance, and people learn. I think people learn to live with it. People that are chronic arthritis patients that really, they live, even when they take drugs to reduce the pain, they're living with a level of pain, and they just live with it. And after a while, they basically don't notice it. Yeah.
There's still sometimes that here, but I don't know. It's just weird thinking that, X amount of years ago, I was in the ER every other month.
Have you correlated that with diet at all? You might think about that.
I still eat.
You might think about that. We have a cousin. I'm not saying that this is the issue,
Yeah.
but she was having all sorts of symptoms that were being diagnosed as endometriosis. And so, first thing that happened was this doctor down in Colorado Springs did an exploratory surgery, found nothing.
Oh, no, they don't.
Yeah, found nothing.
My appendix.
Yeah.
It was my appendix. Golf ball size endometriosis.
Yeah. Well, they found nothing in her.
Yeah.
And so shortly thereafter, she had another attack of whatever it was. And they did another exploratory surgery for endometriosis. And my wife and I are looking at each other and saying, what?
Well, sometimes it can be.
Yes, that was the excuse.
Yeah.
On the third one is when we started screaming
Yeah.
and saying, you need another doctor, you need to find out. Turns out they went and actually did the genetic and antibody tests for celiac disease, goes right back to gluten, for celiac disease. And she had one of the worst cases of celiac anyone had ever seen. She cannot eat a crumb of bread without being on the floor for hours in pain. She's very, very difficult to feed, as you can imagine. And when we go to a family function, everybody has to sort of tiptoe around her and take food she can eat. And our response is, we'll take something she can eat and we'll take something the rest of us like, which sometimes causes a little conflict, but, yeah, well, yeah, that's right. But anyway, it turned out she was celiac. As I said, and then her parents were tested, and both of them were positive for the major celiac genes. Neither of them have the disease. So what's going on? I don't know. But we do know that that's one example that I think pretty clearly made me understand that celiac is real, because it's really correlated well. We finally got it correlated with her diet, and I think that's what got us to send her off to the specialist in the first place. Is we were correlating it with flour, eating anything with flour in it,
Yeah.
and that's pretty much a dead giveaway when someone has that kind of a reaction, that they should be tested at least. And quite frankly, this has been now 10 years ago that this was finally done. That was back before they really were recognizing celiac as a major problem in some people. So now people are a lot more prone to being tested. But nonetheless, that was it. She was in really literally horrible visceral pain. So.
Allergies. And my grandpa, everybody in his family before him was allergic to eggs, but now after him, not a single one of us have that allergy.
So that gene disappeared.
Well,
or it's a
we could-
recessive.
right, we could possibly be carrying it and just.
Yeah. Okay, let's
Yeah.
take a 15-minute break. We'll take our break for the night. And okay. Now, we talk about pain transmission. I mentioned that I talked about two things that are normal, what I would call normal pain, like normal process, and it does happen. And we do have compounds that act as endogenous opioids. Endorphins are used to fight pain. And here's why, in some cases, I think people with chronic pain learn to live with it. I think they produce more endorphins. Yeah. Right. And what they do is they essentially close the gate on that signal. They stop. And they actually are binding to the opiate receptor, which is the weird thing. The real question always was, why in the world would the body have an opiate receptor? And then we found endorphins, which are the natural opioids. And that wasn't until the 60s or early 70s, really. Anyway. Some work has been done in that line, not real successfully so far. Yeah. I mean, people have studied the endorphins, and the thing is, you can't just use endorphins. Pharmaceutical industry isn't interested in them because they're natural compounds and you can't get a patent on them. So, and those are the people that develop drugs. Nobody else will. Somebody asked me one time why the government couldn't develop a drug, and I just laughed because although I'm certainly not a rabid dyed-in-the-wool super capitalist, government doesn't have the ability to do that. The process. This is the government. This would end up with government regulating itself, the FDA. So it isn't going to happen, and nobody wants it to happen. And of course, you can make all sorts of jokes. One of the lines out of the movie about Apollo 13, the Apollo mission that had the explosion on board, and it was touch and go as to whether the astronauts were going to be able to be brought home. Well, one of the problems was that they did not have, they lost the ability to filter stuff out of the air, make the air breathable, and they had filters for that. So they decided to try and adapt the filter that was in the lunar landing module to service the entire capsule. The problem is the lunar landing module was designed by one contractor and the rest of the capsule by another, and the filters were incompatible. And one of the lines was the guy that's sitting there at NASA, and he looks at me, tell me this wasn't a government project. And that's really, do you want drugs developed by the lowest bidder? The answer is no, thank you. No, thank you. I've always thought that was a stupid system, and it should be the median bid ought to get the contract. By golly, we'd find accurate bids, and you wouldn't have overruns, cost overruns. So it'd be interesting to see, but that isn't going to happen for that reason. Anyway, as I said, if you massage an area of pain, the pain feels better. That's why, it hurts, rub it, right? The pain goes away. That's because of the gate theory. We've overcome that pain sensation. So what do we use to control pain? Well, there are two types of drugs that we can use to block pain. One is analgesics. These are medications that block the pain, relieve the pain without causing loss of consciousness. Okay, and we have anesthetics, which basically they cut off the sensory impulses from the brain and cause unconsciousness. Now, all they do is cause that unconsciousness. Your eyes still work, your ears still work. You can actually talk when you're under anesthesia. I've often wondered what interesting things doctors have heard on the operating table.
I'm sure there's a blog.
There might be.
I know one.
Oh,
So the first surgery I ever had was it was more of a surgery, they were fixing the muscle in my leg after the doctor hit.
Mm-hmm.
And I was under anesthesia. It wasn't necessarily heavy anesthesia, but it wasn't, hey, I'm awake. I don't know why I said it, but it was something along the lines of really liking cats because dogs are rude. Mind you, I was like 8.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you still think cats are better?
Oh yeah. I love dogs. I do. Like I'm not afraid of them. At the time, I guess.
Yeah. I'm sure interesting things are said, but doctors have learned the hard way not to say insulting things about the patient in the operating room, because the patient hear it. And although the patients don't remember it, they wake up hating their doctor.
Although sometimes I very
Yes. Yeah. Well, they used to, and part of it, I think, is the kind of it's kind of gallows humor, because surgery is a brutal thing. You're slicing people open. You're doing vivisection. You're cutting open a living human being. And, surgeons are, I'm sure there are surgeons that find that kind of okay. But I'm sure there are others that understand that they are brutalizing patients. And so they hide it with humor. The problem is they pick the wrong humor sometimes and make insulting remarks about the patient. That's not good. But patients remember it. Anyway, and in terms of other ways of killing pain, we have local anesthetics. The most common one that people use is lidocaine. Injecting it if you're getting stitches, you may get a lidocaine injection in the area so that you don't feel it when they're sewing you up. Or if you go to a dermatologist and they want to biopsy some thing that's on your skin because they don't like it, they'll inject a little lidocaine right there it's basically like in your injections class when you do the intradermal. It's the same very small needle, and it's not a painful process, but it does kill the pain. And minor surgeries sometimes will be done under exactly that, lidocaine. So, but most of these local anesthetics are what we call canes. So like lidocaine, Novocaine, Procaine, benzocaine, etc. The analgesic side is where we're going to spend most of our time talking. Analgesia, the word, of course, you remember from medical terminology, is composed of 2 parts, an and algesia. Algesia referring to pain, and referring to anti or against or no. So we have analgesia. That's what we're dealing with. Many of them have multiple actions. They are antipyretics, meaning they will reduce fever as well as pain, and they're also anti-inflammatories, many of them. Usually, what happens with our pain management is that we're interfering either by depressing the CNS with a general anesthetic, or interfering with the transmission of the signals. We're going to talk about non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, of which the ones that we're most commonly familiar with right now are aspirin and ibuprofen. Acetaminophen is not a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory because it has no anti-inflammatory activity. It will lower fever. It is analgesic. We don't know how it works. The anti-inflammation property of the NSAIDs all come from inhibiting prostaglandins, and that results in reducing the signal, reducing inflammation, and reducing the downstream set of events that leads to fever. They interfere with a step in things that lead to both leukotrienes and prostaglandins. Leukotrienes is another major set of molecules that we won't talk about tonight. The NSAIDs that we are familiar with, besides aspirin and ibuprofen, we also have Aleve, naproxen. Some people use that. Aspirin's been around for 100 and closing in on 150 years. We didn't know how it worked until the 1980s. And the reason we didn't know how it worked is we didn't know about the prostaglandins until about the 1960s or early 70s, when they were actually discovered. We didn't have the tools to even discover them until then. And then when we started getting into the cascade of events that cause inflammation, we discovered these long chain fatty hormone-like molecules called prostaglandins. And then a couple of other people did a bunch of experimental work and figured out that the series of long chain fatty acids and fatty molecules that lead to prostaglandins are acted on by an enzyme called cyclooxygenase. And there are two of those, cyclooxygenase 1 and 2. And what they do is they take these molecules and form a ring that is the sort of head of the prostaglandin molecule. And what happens is aspirin and ibuprofen and other NSAIDs interfere with that cyclization process, interfere with those cyclooxygenase enzymes. Others that have been around for ages, indomethacin, which used to be sold as Indocin. It's no longer sold under that name anymore. It's a generic only. It is used, has been used to treat gout. Gout is another extremely painful condition. Generally speaking, we see gout described as something in the big toe, swollen and red and painful. Uric acid crystals get deposited in the joints, and those crystals grind on the bone and cartilage and create incredible pain. Well, it turns out you can have gout anywhere in your body. Yeah, and I have a brother-in-law who has been debilitated at times with gout in his wrists. He was a fireman. I think it probably the use of his hands in working with firefighting equipment probably disposed him toward the disease. Agent Orange?
I don't know. They blame all of his gout on things that happened over in Vietnam. Because there's a lot of it that we don't know, but his doctors do, just because he'll talk to them, which completely understandable.
Yeah.
But they blame it on whatever happened over in Vietnam. So.
Yeah, the use of defoliants, especially Agent Orange, has proven to be a really bad choice. We have a friend who died about 5 years ago from Agent Orange related diseases. I've known of a number of other people that have too.
They also blame that for my dad's infertility. My sister was born before he left, and I'm adopted, so they blame it on his infertility as well.
Which may be related.
Yeah.
There are all sorts of effects that come from. That's why you shouldn't be engaging in chemical warfare, but that's a different story too. But other drugs, there are many other anti-inflammatory drugs. There is actually the list of anti-inflammatory drugs is quite large. The anti-inflammatory drugs themselves include a lot of things that are still prescription only. I think indomethacin is still prescription only. Diclofenac, meloxicam, several others. that we have that are anti-inflammatories are still prescription. The reason they are still prescription is that they have much more severe side effects than things like aspirin, ibuprofen, and naproxen. So that's why some of those drugs are over the counter, and these others are not. Aspirin is still one of the largest selling drugs in the world. It has been basically the largest. It was for many years. It was the largest selling drug in the world. And part of that's because there wasn't a whole lot of competition. But another part was that it was heavily marketed by Bayer and Wellcome and several other companies that were making aspirin products. The aspirin itself is recommended for low to moderate pain and rheumatoid arthritis. And right now, one of the biggest reasons people take it is to lower the risk of TIA and MI, myocardial infarction, through its antiplatelet activity. So it is, besides being an anti-inflammatory, it of course relieves pain, mild pain, but also reduces fever. We don't use them in kids. We talk about baby aspirin, but there's no such thing as a baby aspirin. We don't give aspirin to babies, period. Baby aspirin merely refers to the little bitty ones. Normal aspirin is 325 milligrams. A baby aspirin is 81 milligrams, which is essentially 1/4 of an aspirin. People take it for to reduce the plaque buildup that can come and cause problems. Works pretty well. But the data, I've seen the data on this, and it seems like there's no reason to take a baby aspirin. You could take a regular aspirin. Now, most people are going to say, well, 81 milligrams has got to be a safer dose than 325. Normally speaking, I would agree. And in fact, it is. But the side effect profile is only marginally worse for a full aspirin, and mostly it has to do with gastric irritation, which can be ameliorated with food. The difference is that the baby aspirins cost more. They're much more expensive than a whole aspirin. In fact, if you really are worried about money, you could buy a bottle of cheap aspirin and just cut the pills into quarters. And some people do that. Nothing wrong with it.
I sometimes overhear like customers say, "Oh, my doctor said I need baby aspirin, or not baby aspirin. I guess it was baby aspirin. Baby aspirin. I mean, why would a doctor recommend baby aspirin? Same thing."
Baby aspirin, well, because it's lower strength, and you are there are there's a little bit of safety margin. The problem is, it's just, to me, the reason that we never got into that was because the data say that it doesn't matter whether you take a quarter of an aspirin, 81 milligrams, or a full one. And it's money, purely money. Why spend more money? I mean, yeah, you're taking more drug. And the general rule of thumb is the less drug you need, the less drug you take, right? But then you have to look at the money. Who are the people that are more likely to be taking these drugs? Well, they're going to be older people. Many of them are going to be on fixed incomes. So they have to worry about, pennies, literally, sometimes. So, but basically it is, don't get caught up in the baby aspirin thing. If you can afford it, I'd say do it, because it's better not to take more drug than you need. But if it's a money thing, you don't have to worry about it. Just with aspirin or any of these things, all of them, with the exception of Tylenol, are gastric irritants. So in all cases, you need to take food, unless you have enteric coated. Remember, enteric coating allows it to go through the stomach and then release in the small bowel, where you don't have the problem. Other NSAIDs are in some ways differently tolerated, sometimes better than aspirin. But they also have somewhat lower efficacy in all areas, analgesia and anti-inflammatory activity and antipyretic activity. However, they all work. They also have many other issues associated with them. They do inhibit things like platelet aggregation, and therefore they prolong bleeding time. So people on anticoagulants should not take them. Okay, just like any other drug, you should never take anything. If you're taking any form of drug, you should never add anything to it without discussing it with either your doctor or your pharmacist. But you really should not. Ibuprofen came along in the 60s and was an immediate big seller. It was developed as an anti-inflammatory for treating, mainly for treating RA, rheumatoid arthritis. Very high dose, 800 milligrams, as opposed to the current OTC dose, which is 200. And again, they can be used for mild to moderate pain, for arthritis, fever. The problem is, again, ibuprofen's worse on stomachs than aspirin. So you should always take food with ibuprofen. And it can be as little. My daughter uses it when she has severe menstrual cramping. And she'll eat a couple of almonds or a couple of soda crackers and then take and she's never had a problem. The side effects include nausea and vomiting. And because of the nausea is there because the stomach's trying to get rid of something that it knows it's not supposed to have. Because it can also cause ulcers. And that leads to abdominal pain. Ibuprofen, yeah. Ibuprofen is harder on stomachs than aspirin. Yeah, but if you eat something at the same time, if you take, what do you take, 200 milligrams? Yeah. If you eat something, you're not going to have these effects. But I think what happens is if you just take one, I took one on an empty stomach one time just to see what would happen, and I got a pretty horrible stomachache. And it might have been coincidence, but I wasn't about to repeat the experiment. Because it is tough on stomachs. And I don't take drugs, and so my stomach may be more sensitive too. You may want to keep that in mind. I mentioned indomethacin. Again, ulcers, GI bleeding, nausea, vomiting. It can also is very much cleared by the kidneys, such that kidney impairment should be seen. So I said this was developed to treat RA, but also gout. And people use it for tendinitis as well. The PowerPoint presentation here talks about Celebrex, which is a cyclooxygenase 2 inhibitor. This whole class includes Celebrex, meloxicam, a drug called Vioxx. Many of these, Vioxx was removed from the market because we saw a significant increase in heart attack and stroke. We didn't, that was taken off the market. I think recently, meloxicam may still be on the market, but I think Celebrex has been taken off too. The only reason we would keep these drugs on the market, because all of them seem to have a risk of heart attack and stroke, is because some patients actually need them. It's the only thing that's going to work on them. So we use them with care. I mentioned that Tylenol is not considered a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory because it's not an anti-inflammatory. We have no idea how it works, but it's better tolerated. It does not cause the stomach issues. The problem is it can cause acute liver damage, especially in patients who consume large amounts of Tylenol and large amounts of alcohol. It can actually be fatal because it doesn't take all that much to completely destroy your liver. And once your liver goes, you're not doing well. Yeah. Opioids and opiates and narcotics in general. They are made from, they originated in the opium poppy. Now, opium poppies are not like the poppies they sell around here. Opium poppies, the bulb produces a sap a gummy sap that contains opium. And when the gum is processed properly, you get morphine. Morphine was actually isolated in the early 19th century and was quickly seen as a way to deal with pain. We had no general anesthetics at that time. We had no anesthetics at all. The canes weren't even discovered then. In fact, the canes come out of here too because cocaine is the prototypical cane analgesic. But the isolation of morphine gave the doctors a tool to deal with patients undergoing surgery when we didn't have any way of reducing pain. During our Civil War, it was used extensively for patients that were injured. The type of rifle bullet that was used, the mini ball that was used during the Civil War, tore up flesh and shattered bones to the point that when a soldier was injured that way, they would often have to amputate the limb. And they had no analgesic, so they had a couple of ways of doing that. Either give them one heck of a dose of bourbon and knock them out, or after the surgery, and then after the surgery anyway, give them morphine. And so we had tens of thousands of morphine addicts after our Civil War. This is something that's not taught to you in school.
Just
Like most stuff. Yeah, that unfortunately is true. But the analgesics, codeine comes out of this family, and morphine, methadone, fentanyl, hydromorphone, oxymorphone, oxycodone, hydrocodone, all of these are opioids. There is a long, long, long list of these. Most of them come from an effort to find a non-addictive opiate. We have never found a non-addictive opiate. There are lots of theories. The opiate receptor is actually three different kinds of receptors, mu, delta, and kappa. And theories abounded for a while that if you could selectively block, I think, the mu receptor, there would be no addiction. Well, that didn't work. I know of at least two companies that were formed around that idea. Neither one of them exist anymore because they totally failed. So all of these things have been done. Some of these are natural. They are directly out of the opium poppy. Opium itself, the gum, dried up, was a mainstay of the British Empire for 50 years, and actually was the cause of a war between England and China in the mid-19th century. Actually, two wars, the Opium Wars, and it's because the Emperor of China wanted to kill the opium trade because it was destroying his society, and the British wouldn't let him, fought him and beat him. And then the opium trade remained open. And then opium became a major problem in Victorian England, opium parlors. And opium and marijuana were major issues in the United States at the beginning of the 20th century as well. They were really being used a lot. Finally, they have been outlawed. But the opium problem was so widespread in terms of who was using it, which was everybody, that when Conan Doyle wrote his stories about Sherlock Holmes, Holmes was an opium addict when he wasn't working on a case. So that's how bad it was. So what happens is that the opioid analgesics bind to the opioid receptors and basically prevent stimulation of the gate, so then there's no pain impulse transmitted to the brain. Usually they are used for moderate to severe pain. They are most effective, by the way, in acute pain. For long-term chronic pain management, opiates turn out to be no better than non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. That's research that's now coming out. The pharmaceutical industry doesn't particularly like it because they make a lot of money selling these drugs, but the research looks pretty good. Also, we can use them for cough suppression, codeine, obviously. Side effects are all over the place, nausea and vomiting. There's the euphoria, the high that someone taking these things will get. There's respiratory depression. This is the cause of death from opiate, generally the cause of death from opiate overdose. And a few others. Constipation is another one that they suffer from. So there's a whole list of things in here about there's a list of, there's some discussion of some of these. Most of them have all the same uses. Strong analgesic for moderate to severe pain. Morphine is used quite a bit. We use morphine especially in hospice situations. They are dose dependent, meaning the more you give, the more analgesia, the more pain can be reduced, but tolerance develops quickly. All of these opioids are Schedule II controlled substances, which means, remember what the restrictions on Schedule II substances are? Nope, no refills.
No refills.
Little more subtlety, limits on the number of doses that can be prescribed over a period of time to one person. Yeah, and fresh prescription each time. There's no refills, so you have to have a fresh prescription, and they cannot be called, faxed, or emailed in. Have to be brought in, with one exception, that in an emergency situation, someone can get a 2 or 3 day supply, but then they have to bring in that prescription. Codeine was the original dental anesthetic. That's what it was developed as, and worked pretty well. It is both, it's a sedative and a hypnotic, as well as an analgesic. When it's administered alone, it's Schedule II. If you mix it with acetaminophen, it's Schedule III. This is the Tylenol with codeine. Tylenol number 2, 3, and 4. Then you have hydrocodone, hydromorphone, oxycodone, oxymorphone. All of these are semi-synthetic compounds, meaning we start with an opiate component and chemically modify it. All of them have resulted from years of work to find a safe, high opiate analgesic. All of them are Schedule II. This PowerPoint obviously is several years old. It says that hydrocodone is Schedule III, but that has been elevated to Schedule II. And so Vicodin, which used to be the mix of hydrocodone and acetaminophen, used to be given away by the thousands in prescriptions for treating things like chronic pain, PTSD, and other things. And now we've tried to put a clamp on that, but it's really been it's really been Pandora's box. Fentanyl is a drug that people are using. It is probably the most potent of the opiates. It's also the most dangerous. We have injectable and patch forms. It's not supposed to be used for acute pain, although it is occasionally used when someone is in really extreme pain after an injury to help bring them down on that pain scale. But it is the kind of thing that kills people. Methadone is a synthetic that is used to treat addictions, and it too is a controlled substance and is addictive on its own. Tramadol was developed as a centrally acting analgesic with very low action on opioids, and felt that it would not be addictive. The FDA, when it was approved, the company that developed it got the FDA to approve it and got the DEA not to put it on the controlled substance list. It has since now been listed as a Schedule III substance because we now know that it is addictive. It's mostly used now for people for post-surgical pain. We have the antagonists, naloxone, which has been talked about recently here in town. We're trying to equip in areas where there is a significant presence of narcotic overdose. We're starting to train and equip our police with Narcan, which is naloxone. There's some controversy about giving it to resident advisors, RAs in the dorms at CSU. There's a lot of people that are very concerned about that, largely because it requires somebody to be trained to recognize when it can be useful. So we'll see what happens. It can be used to prevent the response of opiates. And naltrexone, its relative, can be used for alcohol dependence as well. I think it's the thing that they give you that makes you violently ill if you drink alcohol. Well, that would certainly stop people from drinking it, but what they really do is they just stop taking the drug and drink the alcohol. That's the bad part. They cause tolerance. Tolerance is when larger doses are required to get analgesia. There is a physical dependence that really is a physiological adaptation to the presence of these things and is a normal response. We expect physiologic dependence. Tolerance and dependence are not addiction. They're not the same. Psychological dependence is addiction. It's the people who think that they can't live, they can't function without these drugs. That's addiction. They crave the drug. So understanding how to deal with these issues of dependence is a critical part of treating. And it's difficult to treat because people have withdrawal symptoms. They have the sweats and the chills and the pain and the cramps and the diarrhea and all sorts of things that happen in terms of narcotic withdrawal. And it is a very ugly thing to watch. Pain is very much, as I said, perception. One of the things that in recent years, we've actually added a fifth vital sign in some places to evaluating a patient, and that is what kind of pain are you in and what are you taking it for, and how much pain do you have. In this slideshow, they have a couple of pain assessment tools, the Lego pain assessment tool and the universal pain assessment tool. This is the classic question of, on a scale of 1 to 10, what is your pain level? So unfortunately, people define the extremes. Fortunately, 0 is no pain. That's pretty easy. But 10 is often described as the worst pain possible, and that's the wrong scale. There are plenty of instances where people underreport their pain because of the worst pain possible. They think about what's the worst possible pain they can feel. My wife had a patient who was clearly in pain and clearly not being managed with her drugs because she kept saying, oh, it's about a 3, because she was told 10 is the worst possible pain that you can imagine. And she imagined somebody trying to saw off her arm with a butter knife, which would be pretty painful. And she thought that was the worst possible pain, and her pain wasn't that bad. So when Susan looked at her and said, okay, let's compare this to the worst pain you've ever felt. And that's where I think 10 should be, the worst pain you've ever felt. At this point, the woman said 8, which was more like where she was. And so that got conveyed back to the doctor, and they adjusted things. But worst possible pain, no, that's a bad scale. Because you will have people who will say, oh, gee, the worst possible. Worst that you've felt. Dealing with any sort of these things, we have to be careful that the patients are followed regularly. And the issue with this, right now we have a major problem. You've all heard, I think probably repeatedly, that we have an opioid epidemic in this country. What that amounts to is an epidemic of opioid-related deaths. I think this figure for either last year or 2016 was 63,000 deaths from opiates in this country, which makes it one of the leading causes of death, more than automobiles, more than cancer. Well, maybe not more than cancer, but it's probably in the top 5 of causes of death. And what we have is a problem of how do we deal with pain? Well, pain has a cause. Acute pain, okay, you broke your arm, you're going to be in acute pain. Okay, great, we can fix that. Your pain will go away. Chronic pain, however, often does not have a diagnosed cause. Or it's something like rheumatoid arthritis, which we look at and say, well, we can't do anything for you. Here, take the painkiller. And people have become addicted. And guess who the largest group of addicted opiate takers are? Ta-da! My age group. Not me, I don't take them, but my age group. And the reason is because as we get older, we start to experience more pain. We get degenerative pain. We get, arthritic type pains. We have all sorts of things that can cause this. A lot of it comes from our lifestyle. I'm not going to argue that it would be better if we had a different lifestyle, if we had better diet, more exercise, blah, blah, blah. We can name a lot of those things. But the fact is, we have a lot of people that are taking these, and there's no alternative other than dealing with the pain. And I'm sorry, I am not going to say that we ought to just look at everybody and say, deal with it. Sort of like, yeah, okay, deal with this then. You just don't want to do that. So there is a rising chorus from my generation saying, okay, folks, we need non-opiate methods of dealing with pain. And I think it's generating a lot of interest in doing some research and effort to actually to find ways of dealing with this. Pain is a huge market. So the pharmaceutical industry is definitely interested, but they're sort of stuck in the opiate region. They should be looking for better ideas. Yes, there are. Yeah, for people who have chronic pain, I've said this to them before. I will tell them go to a naturopath. Have you tried acupuncture? What have you tried to do besides just taking pills? We need to get away from the idea that we can swallow a pill and all our ills will go away. That just isn't. That's not realistic. So, yeah, there are natural things people can do for sure. And they should be looking into it. And as I say, a naturopath can help. But at some point, even a naturopath is going to look at you, a good naturopath, is going to look at you and say, I've done all I can. You may want to go back to your doctor and see what they can do for you. Acupuncture does a pretty good job on some things. And does a very good job on some things, and isn't worth doodly squat for others. I mean, really, it's like anything else, just like any form of medical treatment. But I think probably the issue with pain is that it needs to be taken more seriously by the medical profession. Just writing prescriptions for opiates hasn't worked. And admittedly, you're a doctor, you've got a patient who's in pain, you want to help them. That's legitimate. But there are other things that we need to encourage. So there's a lot of work. The other thing is that when there is pain, there's a cause. Now, sometimes the cause is you can't do anything about it. We don't have a cure for rheumatoid arthritis. We don't have a cure for collapsed discs in the spine causing central nervous system pain. What do? We put in rods, and what happens? The spine above and below the rod breaks. We do spinal fusions, and the spine above and below the fusion breaks because we're not dealing with what's the underlying problem, which is the bone structure is deteriorating. Okay, we have drugs that can theoretically strengthen bones. They work for about 2 years. So we really need to be looking at causes instead of symptoms. And unfortunately, the use of drugs is always based on treating a symptom. Okay, high blood pressure is a symptom of what? We don't know. Some cause. So we give them a drug to reduce their blood pressure. It doesn't work. So we give them another drug. It doesn't work. We give them another drug until we finally get to a combination that works. But we're treating the symptoms. And it's the same with pain. Pain is probably the worst. And one of the reasons is that pain is so mysterious and it's so personal. Okay. Yeah, so the key with these things is to find a regimen of treatment. If we're going to use treatment, we need to find a regimen of treatment that actually reduces pain and increases for chronic pain patients. I'm really talking about chronic pain here. Acute pain, we just treat, and we usually, if it's acute, we've got a good idea of what the cause is. So we treat the cause, take care of it, and during the healing process, keep them pain-free. Or, excuse me, keep a person who is in the process of leaving this plane of existence, keeping them comfortable in a hospice situation. But what we want to see is when we are actually treating people, pain causes you to, it interferes with your life. Chronic pain interferes with your life. And so what we want to do is see that our treatment is actually improving the life of our patients. Okay, so questions? Okay, Perla, I hope you will eventually watch this. I want you to send me an email. And in that email, I want you to put the word Latvia, L-A-T-V as in Victor, I-A. And hope to see you next week. And I'm going to stop the recording and actually end the recording.